So first out of the gate, Jim, a question for you, and you can take a guess. How many downloads have we had on more than 9 years of How Do We Fix It?
Oh, geez, Richard. I was told there would be no math. You tell me.
Well, I'll tell you that the total downloads are 495,887. And I asked Miranda Schaefer about this. Yeah, just about 500,000.
Miranda, our wonderful producer who has been with us from day one of this podcast.
And who is getting married in the next couple of days to Mike.
Mazel tov.
So congratulations. Yeah.
That's great.
So I asked Miranda for this number because this is our final episode as co-hosts. How Do We Fix It will continue with a new focus in the future. But Jim, our podcast partnership is ending, at least for now. So coming up, what we've learned from each other. And the answer, in brief, is quite a lot. Our show is about fixes.
Yeah, how to make the world a better place.
How do we fix it?
How do we fix it?
So this is it. We started doing these podcasts every week in the spring of 2015. So, close to a decade.
Yeah, it's been a wonderful partnership, and I think it's deepened our rich friendship. They say about guys, you got to work on a project together, and we've certainly done that.
That's right, yeah. We wasn't building a boat or something like that, but we certainly built something here that I think we're both really proud of.
Yeah.
And it's been a good run. I feel like when we started, you and I both had this idea. We were like a couple of voices in the wilderness looking for this goal of more open-minded conversations about tough issues and looking for people willing to grapple with all kinds of ideas and information that doesn't necessarily fit their comfortable worldviews or those of all of our listeners, and challenging ourselves and each other. And what's cool is that in the years since, this idea that we need to do a better job of reaching across ideological divides and listening to contrarian opinions, it's become kind of a movement. And, we have the Heterodox Academy that you've done some work for, Braver Angels, Living Room Conversations, one of our first podcasts on this topic years ago, Solutions Journalism, another movement that we feel like is very akin to what we're doing. And then all these new news outlets, people like the Quillette and the Free Press and a gazillion really good podcasts. So, in some of the ways, some of the trends that we were hoping to push along in our very small way at the start are really happening.
Yeah, and I came out of mainstream media. I was at ABC News for more than 30 years. The media always covers catastrophes and very rarely asks, okay, what do we do with that information? How can we make things a little bit better? And you also came out of mainstream media in a way, didn't you, Jim, with magazines?
Yeah, I had just left 10 years at Popular Mechanics magazine, which was kind of a dream job for me. And that I think helped lead to the idea that both of us had. We kicked around a few different ideas at first, but this idea of fixing stuff, how do we fix it?
I am so glad that when we started this podcast, we added a question mark at the end, because it could have been a laundry list of suggestions from us and from guests. Okay, here's how you fix things. And it hasn't been. It's been kind of an invitation to curiosity. We're at risk of being stuck so much in our own lanes that we're not thinking of how we can learn from each other. And I feel like we were among the first people to really raise some of these problems on our podcast.
And the people that we've had on are the people who were pushing this forward, people like Jonathan Haidt and others who were asking these tough questions. And one thing I think we both found as we moved along with the How Do We Fix It theme is sometimes the hardest part of how you fix something is analyzing the problem correctly, or opening up your mind to the idea that the problem might be different from what you expected, and the solutions might be trickier, more nuanced than you expected.
Or just even asking better questions.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Before we were prepping for this show and looking back through our lengthy catalog of really interesting guests, because we've done well over 400 shows together, Jim, you said, come on, Richard, we have to tell people why we've decided to wrap it up now. We've become a lot busier in our own lives than was the case before. You're a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. You write for City Journal and for Commentary, and you appear on Commentary's podcast. That's quite a lot of distraction from how do we fix it. I've been getting more involved in what I do call the bridging community, the loose coalition of groups, including Braver Angels and Common Ground Committee, that are pushing back against rigid partisan polarization. I feel personally that polarization is among the very biggest problems we have in the country and is holding up common sense agreement on a whole range of issues. So I'm planning to do some more podcasts about the movement, what it's been getting up to in the coming months. And then I'm also spending more time with a nonprofit group in the New Haven area called Interfaith Volunteer Caregivers that works to bring seniors together and deliver services to older people, many of whom are very lonely and live on their own.
I think for both of us, this has been always a high point of our week, or recently, the last few months, we've been mostly doing these every other week. And I wouldn't be honest with our listeners if I didn't tell them what I tell all my friends when I talk about the podcast, which is basically, Richard, that you do all the work, and Miranda, of course. So I'm very appreciative of that. But even so, my position at the Manhattan Institute involves writing, but also some big research projects that are very time consuming, and I really need to make sure I set aside the time for that.
So we haven't fallen out of our friendship. It's not like we're so much at loggerheads we don't want to talk to each other anymore. It's not that.
We've survived our. I mean, for people, not everybody maybe knows, but when we set out, our idea was, okay, a liberal and a conservative will get together and hash things out. Well, the irony is you're not all that liberal and I'm not all that conservative. We're both pretty heterodox in our thinking, but nonetheless, we come to ideas from very different perspectives. We've been able to hash them out and argue and discuss with reasonable civility.
I've got to say that I've learned so much from you, and you are a bit of an odd duck in one sense that, you celebrate being a contrarian. And also, I'm never quite sure what your response to an issue is going to be, which is kind of great. Sometimes I'll go, oh, God, I'm not sure I can have that guest on because Jim's going to think she's too liberal. And then you go, yeah, great, let's do it.
All my friends are liberal. You know what I mean? So it's not like I can't handle liberals. But if we're going to be talking ideas, I'm not interested in doctrinaire liberals. I'm interested in all these liberals who are open to different ideas or come at things from a different perspective.
I'm kicking around this idea of the reliable narrator. There's almost too much information out there, certainly too many opinions. And so it's very difficult to figure out, at least for me, it's difficult to figure out, well, where does the truth lie? And I'm now increasingly finding that the first people I turn to are the people who are unafraid of criticizing their own side. I did want to get back for a moment to this. What have I learned from you? One of the things I learned very early on was to completely change my mind about nuclear power. I had this standard view of, oh God, there's waste, and we had 3 Mile Island, and it's a terrible thing. And I'm really struck that just in the past even few months, there's been growing support for nuclear power.
This is phenomenal. Congress just passed this huge bill that attempts to streamline nuclear power, change how the Nuclear Regulatory Commission works, get them some more staff, take down some of the. Most people don't know that nuclear power is burdened with not just reasonable safety precautions, but all kinds of regulatory burdens that no other industry faces, that are way out of proportion to what's necessary for safety. And this bill passed almost unanimously. I think one of the only people to vote against it was Bernie Sanders. And to me, I've been writing about this. We've been talking about this from early in the podcast. I've done a gazillion articles on it. And I do believe nuclear power is our best source of clean, green energy, and we need a lot more electricity. We're not going to get there with wind and solar. So yeah, I'm really happy this topic that we've come back to again and again on this podcast and in my other journalistic work we're really making headway on it. And that could be great for the planet, for the economy, for human flourishing.
On that happy note, let's pause for just a moment. This is How Do We Fix It? I'm Richard Davies.
And I'm Jim Meggs.
You can find all of our podcasts and back catalog at howdowefixit.me. Moving on from what we've learned from each other.
Whoa, you didn't give me a chance to talk about what I've learned from you, Richard.
Oh, okay.
Well, coming out of print and text-based journalism, it was a real great learning experience seeing the craftsmanship that goes into a well-produced audio vocal presentation. And I hadn't thought about these things very much. And I wasn't listening to a lot of podcasts when we started. And over the years, I've become one of those people who's just all about podcasts. I don't even have cable news anymore. I listen to my friends at Commentary Magazine every day. I listen to our former guest, Barry Weiss, on her podcast, and so many others. Mm-hmm. And it's such a wonderful way to get information. So intimate. It's so kind of personal. So I've got that from you. I also learned a lot about approaching ideas with a certain humility and kind of a gentility, a graciousness towards guests that I think has been a real hallmark of this.
Well, that's touching, but the only reason why I do that is because I'm so lousy at debating. You're so much better at that than me.
I hope our podcast hasn't come off too much like a debate.
No,
I know there's times that I might have gotten a little overheated now and then. I am passionate about these things.
So let's move on from ourselves and each other to our guests, because you've had just such a remarkable number of guests. And I think that some of the most persuasive and successful of them have been humble about their opinions, about their qualifications. For instance, I love the modesty and open-mindedness of this young PhD researcher, Alina Chan, who raised very fundamental questions. And we were among the first podcasts to give an airing to her views. She was talking about the origins of the COVID pandemic and raising the strong possibility that COVID was spread not from a wild market in Wuhan, China, but from a lab leak. And she laid out her case in such a calm and even kind manner, and was not dismissive of people she disagreed with, despite the fact that she'd been trashed by some of her much more famous scientific opponents.
Not only gracious, but very brave. I mean, here's a woman in relatively early phase of her career and doing postdoc studies, and taking on the biggest names in the establishment of the field of virology. There have been hearings in the Senate just this last couple of weeks that are continuing to show a lot of evidence for the lab leak, and show, sadly, that our public health officials, including the sainted Anthony Fauci, were deeply dishonest in trying to cover up their long history of grants and research money that was flowing to the Wuhan Institute. I don't think that research was intended in any nefarious way, but it should have all been disclosed the minute the pandemic started. The idea they were trying to cover up these footprints, even if they were completely innocent, is outrageous.
And the case of Alina Chan raises something else in my mind, which is that when it comes to deplatforming and canceling people of whatever political persuasion, that the people whose careers suffer the most are not the famous tenured professors. The people who really suffer are people like Alina Chan, young people who don't have tenured positions, who aren't best-selling authors, and who are often very brave and pay for it with their careers.
Absolutely. And that's one reason I'm so happy that so much of this podcast is focused on this atmosphere that the wrong kind of speech isn't just an idea you disagree with, but some kind of violence or some kind of contagion that needs to be shut down. People need to be protected from it. It's very, very current still in our college campuses. I'm happy to be part of the fight against that.
Yeah, and you were a part of the fight against it before I realized it was such a big problem. So I give you credit for that. So let's talk about some of our favorite guests and favorite podcasts. Why don't you start first, Jim?
I like the ones where you feel like you get to know a person personally a little bit. It's not just about the ideas. Early in the Ukraine war, we talked to Yale professor Marcy Shore, who spent a lot of time there. And it wasn't so much that we learned an entire history lesson on Ukraine, although we learned a lot. But she talked about her friends and her relationships and the calls that she's getting in the middle of the night as that war was getting underway. It's very moving. Roosevelt Montas from Columbia University, great story. This smart immigrant kid or child of immigrants who practically educated himself. He found a copy of Plato that somebody was throwing out and started reading the Socratic dialogues on his own. And now he teaches at Columbia. Just such a great story and such a cool person to meet. One of the things that I've really liked about the podcast, especially before the pandemic when we were doing them in person more, but over Zoom, but to a slightly less extent, is just this feeling of getting to know somebody. I remember when we were sitting with Barry Weiss in your apartment on the Upper West Side when we used to record there.
Yeah, this is when Barry Weiss, who had been an opinion writer at the New York Times, who just felt increasingly uncomfortable there, and left, right?
Yeah. And she was still there at the time, and she'd just come out with a book called How to Fight Anti-Semitism, which is sadly even more relevant today than when she wrote it. And she was a bit of a free thinker, independent thinker, wanted a bigger diversity of ideas in the opinion section, and was just kind of hounded out of there by a lot of her very doctrinaire colleagues, and now has launched the Free Press, one of the most exciting journalistic enterprises.
And you'll be so proud of me, Jim, because about 2 days ago I took out my paid subscription to the Free Press.
I just find that so refreshing. I respect those people who've been willing to change their minds. Those are some of my favorite episodes, really. People like Ashley Ahern.
Ashley Ahern, NPR reporter who left Seattle and now lives in rural Washington State.
And hangs out with cowboys and all these people she never would have known in Seattle. And, these, probably Trump voters, she doesn't care. She's friends with them. And that was a great example of really living this idea of opening up your mind to different types of people. Another similar case, Megan Daum, another one with a good podcast, former LA Times writer. Listening to these people tell their journey towards a different kind of open-mindedness has been great.
Yeah. One example I have, which is on the other side, is Jonathan Rauch, who's from the center-right, who strongly pushed back against both the left and the right and the populist right in his book, The Constitution of Knowledge. That book is really wonderful.
But I would put that book as one of the most important books of the last few years for explaining why these Enlightenment values that are so under attack from the far left and the far right today, of free speech, individuality, democracy, rational inquiry, and the use of real scientific skepticism, not wild conspiracy theory thinking. All these things require an infrastructure of traditions, of institutions like universities and stuff, and they're under attack across the board. And it's a very important book, and it was great to have him on. You know what else I've really liked is people who taught me something about human nature. Insights into the human mind, the human spirit. One of my all-time favorite episodes with Chloe Valdery, who is just a really interesting thinker. And she has this program she calls the Theory of Enchantment, where she taps into pop culture, movies like The Lion King, for universal lessons about humanity, and then uses them to start conversations about getting past racism, getting past assumptions about people we might not agree with politically. And it's very humanistic and very kind of a gentle and loving approach to getting people to understand each other and themselves better, and not build their identity on the negativity of assuming the people on the other side are all evil.
I like our three shows with Matthew Continetti, who talked about conservatives, Nick Gillespie on libertarians, and Brian Garston on liberals. All three of those guests made the case for their own tribe, as it were, but they weren't afraid to criticize their own movements. And all three of those shows were with people who really thought deeply about different aspects of political culture. And then also something that you introduced me to, Jim, the idea of celebrating innovation and technology. Eric Berger, who wrote about SpaceX and Elon Musk and how Musk changed and challenged NASA and Boeing and other big players in the space race. And then our visit when we were doing podcasts more face-to-face, when we both put on our smart clothes and went to the Museum of Natural History in New York and spoke to Neil deGrasse Tyson about his love of science and space.
That was fun. You don't get a lot of words in edgewise when you interview Neil deGrasse Tyson.
We spoke with Neil. He was very generous with his time for well over an hour, and I think we asked about 4 questions.
That's right. He's just basically push play.
And finally, one more guest to give a shout out to. AJ Jacobs, who wrote a book called Thanks 1,000. AJ talking about the power of gratitude. And I must say right now, I don't know about you, Jim, I'm feeling a lot of gratitude for everything.
Hey, I wrote that line.
Yeah, I know. I stole it.
You stole my line. So I think I've learned a lot about gratitude on this podcast and having a sense of gratitude. And one thing I have a lot of gratitude for, as I said earlier, is all the heart and soul and talent that you've poured into this project. For Miranda's expert editing and producing over these years, who always, as a friend of mine on another podcast says, makes us sound better than we deserve.
She certainly really has. Yeah.
Being surrounded by real pros is always great. It's very comforting.
And thank you. And a very special shout out to Miranda, who not only has been remarkably kind and helpful, but also someone who at times, I've called up at 10 o'clock at night about a show that was to be released at 5 the next morning going, oh my gosh, we have to change something. And she'd go, yeah, okay, we can do that. And
yes.
I'm really grateful for that and for her just being constantly there and feeling that she had our backs in every possible way.
And now for people who want to continue this conversation and stay engaged, you and I are both on social media. I'm still on, I hate to call it X, but to me it's still Twitter, but I still am on Twitter several times a day. I think it remains a really useful medium, not so much for wild opinions. I don't like that part of it, but for information about all kinds of really interesting fields.
And Jim's handle on Twitter, or X, is James B. Meggs. Mine is Davies Now. We also have a site on Twitter for our show, which is Fix It Show. And we have links to all of them on our website, howdowefixit.me. We have more than 400 shows to listen to, and I'm proud of what we've done together.
It's definitely a bittersweet moment for me, Richard. I played in an Americana band kind of somewhere between blues and bluegrass for we toured for about 10 years all around the country. And it was really exciting and fun, and the people in the band were my best friends. But I remember the day that the band leader called me and said, we'd lost one of our members, and we were getting too busy, and we were going to stop touring, basically break up the band, except for we get together and perform occasionally, but very rarely. And I had this real sense of almost of a kind of grief. It was a big part of my identity of who I am, if I introduced myself. So, and I'm feeling kind of that way now. I'm sort of, this is always, every time I write for the Wall Street Journal or anybody, this is always part of my bio and a very important chance to explore this world of ideas that we live in. So I've really appreciated this journey with you.
Well, I better send you a condolence card.
Anyway, so Richard, are you ready?
I am ready
for the final time?
This is How Do We Fix It? I'm Richard Davies.
And I'm Jim Meggs.
And as always, thanks for listening. And thank you to Miranda, our producer.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.